Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 40th talk of the Rail Enthusiast Society. We started these talks when COVID hit us. I presume we would have started these talks anyway, but COVID hastened the process, and we are today having a 40th talk. I happen to be the person giving the talk myself. So normally I introduce other people, so I'll introduce myself. My name is L Singh. I'm the secretary of the Rail Enthusiast Society and one of the founder members. The topic of my talk is Globe-trotting by an Indian railwayman. I joined the Indian Railways as a special class railway apprentice at Jamalpur in 1966. And since then, right up to today, I've been a railwayman. There's an old saying that once a railwayman, always a railwayman. And I think that applies to almost everyone, and it certainly applies to me. Of course, I did not continue with the Indian Railways right through, but I remained a railwayman all the same. Till 1993, I worked with the Indian Railways, and after that, I joined a company called RITES Limited. RITES, it's briefly the consultancy wing of the Indian Railways. So through RITES, I was able to travel virtually all over the world, and that is why I'm in a position today to talk about globe-trotting all over the world. In fact, the only continent I've not been to is Australia. Even before I joined RITES, one of the countries that I was able to go to was Vietnam. So I will start my talk today by talking to you about Vietnam. One thing I can certainly mention that wherever you go, whichever country it may be a big country or a small country. It may be a rich country or a poor country. It may be in your neighborhood. It may be on the other side of the world. Any country you go to or any place you go to certainly increases your experience. You gain a lot, and you understand the world more than you would have understood if you had stayed in your own country. I was very fortunate. I was able to go to about more than a dozen countries in Africa, North America, even 2 countries in South America, a country in the Caribbean, countries in Europe, countries in my neighborhood, all through the Indian Railways. So let me start with the first country I visited, and that was Vietnam. Have a look at the map of Vietnam. It is a very interesting country. If you see its slenderness ratio, which is the length divided by the breadth, it is probably the highest of all countries in the world, except Chile in South America and Gambia in Africa. These 2 countries are probably even slenderer than Vietnam. From north to south, Vietnam is roughly 1,1700 kilometers. And at the narrowest point, it is less than 100 kilometers wide. It's only in the north where it flares up a little and becomes about 300 kilometers wide. But otherwise, the average width is only about 200 kilometers. Now, since the country has this shape, obviously the railways will also have the same shape. As you can see, there is one line starting from Saigon, which has been renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and it goes all the way through the country to Hanoi. It is only north of Hanoi, in the lines that go towards China, that you have standard gauge also. Otherwise, the entire system is meter gauge. You can obviously imagine that, say, when India has a war for 20 days or a month, our economy goes back quite a bit. So Vietnam, which was at war almost continuously from 1939 to 1975, when the Americans left Vietnam, at war for more than 30 years, you can well imagine that the country's economy was in shambles. I was there from 84 to 87, only 10 years after the war was over. So the country was still in very bad shape, economically and otherwise. As I mentioned earlier, Vietnam was the first country that I happened to visit. In fact, not only was it the first country that I visited, it was also the first time that I traveled by plane. Till the 90s, it was very rare for an average Indian to travel by air. And most of us probably traveled by air only when we reached our 20s and 30s. Unlike today's kids who travel by air even before they are 1 year old. I was in Vietnam from 84 to 87, and the task was being there as a service engineer for locomotives that we had exported. These locomotives were meter gauge YDM-4 locomotives, which had been built in DLW, now of course called Banaras Locomotive Works. And apart from providing, say, warranty repairs and seeing how the locomotives run, we were also responsible for training and maintenance, training in maintenance and operations of the Vietnamese personnel. I had a team of 5 more people with me. We were a team of 6. Before the project started, we invited about a dozen Vietnamese technicians to India to show them what an Indian Railways shed is like. And they were sent to Jodhpur shed. Now, the shed training itself was all right, but there was a very interesting sub-story. The Vietnamese, like all people from that part of the world, are absolutely non-vegetarian. That means they must have some meat item in every dish that they eat. Unlike India, where even people who are non-vegetarian will have a lot of their meals where there is no meat at all. Now, Jodhpur shed could not provide the kind of non-vegetarian items that they wanted. But there were a lot of pigeons around in the hostel where the Vietnamese were staying, and also in the shed. So one evening, the Vietnamese caught a few pigeons, cut them up and cooked them. Now, that is all very well as far as the Vietnamese went, but you can imagine the kind of reaction we had from the Indians, and it took us quite some time to pacify them. We were told that the locomotives would be brought to Ho Chi Minh City port, which was called Saigon Port, and from there carried by rail, because there was a rail line from the port to the locomotive shed. Now, after I reached Vietnam, I found that it had been 10 years since the last locomotive had arrived in the city, in the port. And in these intervening 10 years, the track between the port and the shed had been completely covered up and destroyed. So in effect, there was no track at all between the port and the shed. So what did we do? I asked the Vietnamese, can you lay a track? So they thought it over and said, no, but the Americans had a lot of trailers that they had left behind in Ho Chi Minh City, which used to carry tanks. And if they can carry tanks, surely they can carry locomotives also. So they took me to one of the old depots where there were these trailers lying. And we found the trailers were definitely good enough to carry a locomotive, without the bogies, of course. Only the trailers were about 3 feet short. So the Vietnamese had no problem at all. And sure enough, 2 days later, they took me to the same place again. And they had welded T-sections to the back of the trailer, increased its length, and built a place where the bogie pivot could rest. So it was quite a spectacle, carrying a locomotive through the streets of Ho Chi Minh City, through some of the most crowded parts. I had taken a few pictures. Unfortunately, I don't know where those pictures are now. Otherwise, I would have shown you a picture of a locomotive going through the main marketplace of Ho Chi Minh City. Incidentally, Ho Chi Minh City was the old Saigon, which was renamed by the Vietnamese after the country was unified, after the North and South Vietnam became one Vietnam again. Ho Chi Minh City comprises of an old area called Saigon and an old area called Cholon, which was the Chinatown of that part. So although the city is Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon still exists. The port is still called Saigon Port, and the locomotive depot was still called Saigon Locomotive Depot, and not Ho Chi Minh Depot. It was still called Saigon Depot. One of the biggest things that I found among the Vietnamese was that they are very, very innovative. I have used a word here called jugadu, which is a Hindi word, which means innovation at impromptu, innovation at its best. I'd always thought that Indians were very good at innovation and at being jugadus, but the Vietnamese beat us hands down. This applied to locomotive maintenance. It also applied to everything else. And I can understand why. When they were at war for 30 years, there was shortage of everything. So obviously the Vietnamese learned how to work without in shortages. I'll give you two examples. One is that of a typewriter ribbon. When I read there, we were in those days when you still had mechanical typewriters and not the present day laptops and all that we have. These typewriters had to have ribbons. Now, I asked the Vietnamese if I could borrow a typewriter from them before my typewriter from India came. They gave me a typewriter, but it did not have a ribbon. So I asked him, what about a ribbon? He says, we are a poor country. We have to import ribbons and we don't have foreign exchange. So we don't have ribbons. I thought he was trying to get ribbons from me. But then I found none of the typewriters in their office had ribbons. So I asked him, how do you manage? He says, we don't have ribbons, but we manufacture carbon paper. We use carbon papers. The first page is blank, but your carbon copies get made. I mean, this was a solution which would never have occurred to anybody else except a Vietnamese. When I mentioned this particular thing to the Indian ambassador in Hanoi, he said then he understood how it was that as an ambassador, he only got carbon copies and not an original. That is what was the interesting thing. Almost all the letters we got in Vietnam were carbon copies and not originals. Another thing I had found when I went around Ho Chi Minh City, at night in particular, that almost all the trucks you saw and all the buses you saw and many cars had only one headlight. And I kept wondering what the case was till when we were unloading our locomotives from one of the ships in the port. There was a consignment very close by where trucks had been imported from Japan. And I found that one of the Vietnamese technicians was removing one headlight bulb from each truck. So I asked our interpreter, why is he doing that? He's saying it is very difficult to get spare headlight bulbs later. So what we do is every truck or car that comes, we remove one headlight bulb and keep it as a spare bulb so that there is no shortage of spares later. Now, these two examples will explain to you how the Vietnamese worked. The same thing applied even to locomotive maintenance. They were not very good at doing routine work and may even dodge it. For example, if they were asked to tighten a particular screw every fortnightly, they would tend not to do that. But if for some reason, after some time, the screw fell off because you had not maintained it, they were at their best. They would use a wire, they would use a rope, they would do something and make sure that the locomotive keeps running. As a result of this particular attitude of the Vietnamese, we had no problem at all. All the 15 locomotives ran very well and continued to run for quite some time, so much so that years later, the Vietnamese placed a second order for YDM-4 locomotives. I will give you a small incident of what Vietnam was like in those days by talking about the time when I had locked my key inside a car in the marketplace of Vietnam. We had gone to the market, we were in the shop, and without realizing it, I shut the door and the car key got locked inside. I had a spare key at home, but even my home key was inside the car, so I would have had no means of entering my home. So what did we do? I mean, we tried various things. I rang up a few of my friends, asked them who had Toyota cars to ask if they can open my car. One or two of them landed up. We tried. The car door would not open. The shopkeeper in front of whose shop the car was standing came out after some time. And he said, he has a friend who's a car thief. Can he call him? I was absolutely intrigued. Car thief? I said, okay, please call him. One Vietnamese gentleman came, very swarthy looking chap, small. I mean, you wouldn't even notice him if you crossed him in the street. He came over, out of his pocket, he took out some kind of a master key. And in 10 seconds, my car door was open. After that, I never left my car parked anywhere in Vietnam. Anyway, I had a very successful stay in Vietnam. The locomotive ran very well. And what I was really impressed by was the innovativeness of the Vietnamese and the kind of very patriotic spirit that they had. Anything that they were asked to do by the country, they would do. And that is the reason why they were able to take on the Americans and defeat them. Incidentally, I had gone to Vietnam while I was still with the Indian Railways, but all my other foreign travel happened after I left the Indian Railways and joined RITES. Most of RITES projects happen to be in Africa. So let us start with what the African railways look like. As you can see, Africa is a very large continent, about 5 times India's size. But the total railway they have is less than the railway that you have in India in terms of track kilometerage and also in terms of the traffic halt. Another difference, while we have a network of track on Indian railways, the African railways are totally disjointed. I mean, there are a lot of small separate systems, as you can see, all over the place, except Southern Africa and to some extent Egypt. There is no rail network anywhere. It is just single lines, double lines, at the most 3 lines. Apart from that, the number of gauges they have is enormous. Towards the northern part of Africa, which is nearest Europe, you have the European standard gauge. The southern part of Africa has what is called the Cape gauge. The Cape gauge is 3 feet 6 inches, slightly more than a meter, 1067 mm. While Eastern Africa and parts of West Africa have got meter gauge. In between, they also have a 600 mm gauge and a 950 mm gauge. So you can see the number of gauges they have is even more than what the Indian Railways had when we had 4 gauges. There has been talk of having a trans-Africa line going all the way from Egypt down to South Africa. But you can imagine the kind of difficulties they would have. Apart from areas where there are no lines, the number of gauges you will encounter is going to be quite difficult. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, RITES was doing projects in a large number of countries in Africa. Therefore, the maximum countries I did visit during my stint with RITES was in Africa. And the first country that I visited in Africa was Botswana. Botswana is the landlocked country in the middle of southern Africa. It has got Zimbabwe and Namibia towards the north, Namibia towards the west, and South Africa towards the east and south. This red line that you can see in the map is the only railway that they have. The main thing about Botswana, if an Indian goes there, is that it is a totally empty country. Unlike India, which is a crowded country, they are a totally empty country. Botswana is about the size of Bangladesh, but it has a population of only about 2 million, 2.5 million now, I presume. When I had gone there in 1993, the population was less than 2 million. The entire population is sort of concentrated along the red line, which is the railway line. The rest of the country is blank, totally empty. The railway line also is basically a line which connects the railways of Zimbabwe with the railways of South Africa. And it was built by the British because all 3, Zimbabwe, then Southern Rhodesia, South Africa, and Botswana, then Bechuana land, were all with the British. So they built this line as a bypass line to save time to go from the southern part of South Africa to Zimbabwe. Now, after Botswana got independence in the early 60s, their railway system was run as a division of the railways of Zimbabwe. But sometime in the 1980s, Botswana felt that they cannot let this continue and they must run the railway system themselves. So Botswana Railways was set up and they started running the railway on their own. Now, they did not have the experience to do so. So in the early stages, they floated global tenders to get managers to run the railway. Some of these posts were manned by people from RITES, including the general manager of the railway, the chief engineer, and the chief of finance. Some of you who are listening to this talk would probably know the general manager. He was Mr. Ramji, who had retired as general manager of Southeastern Railway, and after retirement, got posted through rights in Botswana and was general manager of Botswana Railways. Of course, it must have been quite a difference running Botswana Railways and running Southeastern Railway, because Botswana Railway would be even smaller than one division of the Indian Railways in terms of both size and traffic. The chief engineer was Mr. K.P. Singh, who finally became managing director of rights. The chief of finance was from rights and not from the Indian Railways. I was deputed to go to Botswana to do a study on whether they should have their own heavy repair workshop for the maintenance of their locomotives. Since Botswana Railway was so small, they had a holding of only 39 locomotives. 20 of them were General Motors and 19 of them were General Electric locomotives. And unlike other countries in Africa, Botswana's economy was doing very well. They had the necessary spare parts and they had the necessary foreign exchange to buy the spare parts and not have a problem at all, which almost every other country in Africa did. Now, since they only had 39 locomotives, Botswana was only doing what we would call light repairs and shed repairs within the country. They had their own shed. For any heavy repairs, they were sending their locomotives to South Africa. Now, South Africa was charging them through their nose. They knew very well that Botswana does not have any other option, so they charged them exorbitantly. About, I would say, something like 3 to 4 times what the charges should have been. Not only that, they took all the time in the world. A normal overhaul, which should have taken, say, 30 days or even less, would normally take 3 months, 4 months. And there was a reason for that. When Botswana sent their locomotives to South Africa for heavy repairs, they had to run their railways. So they used to lease locomotives from South Africa to run on Botswana railways. So for these leased locomotives, the charges that the South African charges were also very exorbitant. So in every respect, South Africa was milking the Botswana railways for doing heavy repairs and for leasing locomotives and taking time. Now, this study was commissioned by Mr. Ramji as general manager to see if it was feasible for Botswana Railways to have their own heavy repair workshop. Now, with the kind of charges that they were being charged and the amount of downtime that took place, we were able to justify without any problem that it was quite feasible to set up their own heavy repair facility. Once that report was submitted and the South Africans learned about it, the result was what Mr. Ramji had wanted. The rates were reduced both in terms of time and in terms of what they were being charged. It would not be out of place to mention that at that time, Botswana Railways was actually making a profit. It is one of the few railways in Africa that made a profit during that period. I'm not sure what the position is today. While we were in Botswana, neighboring country is Zimbabwe. We were asked by the rights management to go to Zimbabwe and find out there had been a contract for consultants from rights helping the Zimbabwe Railways, financed by the World Bank. Around that time, the rights contract was terminated, and instead of extending it and continuing with rights, Zimbabwe had given the same work to Canadian consultants. So there were 2 of us in Botswana. We were tasked to go to Zimbabwe and talk to them and find out why they had given the task to Canada and not extended rights contract. Were they not happy with our work, or what was the reason? The reason given by the Zimbabweans was very interesting. They said that, look, they are like beggars. Now, if a beggar is given some money by a middle-class person or is given money by a billionaire, the money has the same value for him. He says both Indian Railways and Canadian Railways were so much ahead of the Zimbabwean Railways that it did not really matter to them whether they got advice from Indian consultants or Canadian consultants. But there was a big difference. Wrights charged something like, I forget the exact figures, $10,000 per month for a consultant. Out of these $10,000, about $4,000 to $5,000 were spent in Zimbabwe in terms of housing for the consultant, what he his living, his day-to-day rations, things like that. So about $4,000 to $5,000 was spent in Zimbabwe and left behind in Zimbabwe, and the remaining $5,000 to $6,000 came back to India. So since the World Bank was paying for this project, Zimbabwe was not losing any money, but with the contract being with Wrights, they were gaining only $4,000 to $5,000 per consultant. The Canadians charged much more. Not only did they charge much more, they also spent more lavishly when they were in Zimbabwe. Result was, each Canadian consultant left behind about $10,000 in Zimbabwe. So what was better for Zimbabwe? Having a Canadian consultant who left behind $10,000 in the country, or an Indian consultant who left behind only $4,000 to $5,000? We didn't really have an answer to that. They were quite sure that as far as the consultancy went and as far as the technical expertise went, they were quite happy with the Indians as well as the Canadians. I spent only a few days in Zimbabwe, but then while we were in Zimbabwe, we decided to go and have a look at Victoria Falls. I will say without any doubt that if you have to go to Zimbabwe only to see Victoria Falls, it is worth the effort. It's an enormous fall, far more impressive than falls like Niagara, which are so well known. It's an interesting fall. If you have a look, the falls are here. The water is falling into a gorge. The falls themselves are in Zambia, and this side of the gorge is Zimbabwe. You get a much better view from this side than you get from Zambia itself. So although the falls are in Zambia, you get a far better view from Zimbabwe. And the falls are about 100 meters high and something like 1.5 kilometers across. It is certainly worth going to Zimbabwe only to see Victoria Falls. When the water falls, a spray of water creating a kind of a cloud rises up, which gives it the local name. In the local name, if you translate it, it works out. The Victoria Falls are called the cloud that thunders, because they make a thundering noise, and it is a kind of a cloud around the falls. One of the countries that I visited in Africa and spent a fairly long time, about 5 to 6 months, was Tanzania. Tanzania is very interesting. As you can see, it has a fair amount of railway. These lines that you see, one line starting from Dar es Salaam, going via Dodoma to Tabora. Incidentally, Dodoma is the capital of Tanzania, not Dar es Salaam, although Dar es Salaam is the biggest city and the biggest port. This line then going to Kigoma and going to Mwanza, and this is Lake Victoria, incidentally. And this line here, these are meter gauge lines, and these are called the Tanzanian Railway. This line here, going from Dar es Salaam into Zambia, is called the Tazara-Zambia Railway, and it was built by the Chinese to give Zambia an outlet to Dar es Salaam port. Zambia is also landlocked. This line is Cape gauge. So the traffic on these two lines is not interchangeable. So this line here is Cape gauge, and the remaining lines are meter gauge. Now, what the World Bank had found was that, incidentally, 15 locomotives had been exported from India to Tanzania even before the locomotives that went to Vietnam. So these locomotives were consuming perhaps 2 to 3 times the fuel than such locomotives should. So the World Bank instituted a study which was given to Wrights to study the fuel accounting system and study these locomotives as to why they were consuming so much fuel. I was nominated for the study along with one more person from the fuel cell of Northern Railway. The two of us had gone to Tanzania and conducted the study. This study was in 2 parts. You first went for 5 months and studied the system, gave your recommendations, and began implementations. A year later, we went again for 1 month to see how the system was being implemented and whether any improvements had taken place. The main thing that we found was that the accounting system design was weak. Not only was the design weak, the implementation was even poorer. Very poor implementation of the accounting system. The result was, it was very difficult to keep account of how much fuel was being put on the locomotive and how much was being consumed, leading to a large amount of pilferage. The pilferage was so high that if you look at the map on the previous page, Dar es Salaam to Tabora was a distance of about 500 kilometers. With the kind of light loads that you had in Tanzania, there would be no problem for one tank full, to take you from Dar es Salaam to Tabora, requiring no refueling on the way. So much fuel was being stolen that the locomotives required refueling at Dodoma. I proposed that I would like to footplate on the locomotive and beyond the locomotive, and we would make sure that it went all the way from Dar es Salaam to Tabora without any refueling. When I went on this footplate, I was given an armed guard to travel with me. I said, why do I need an armed guard? They said the driver of the locomotive knows very well why you are on the locomotive. If he gets an opportunity, he'll push you off the locomotive. They gave me an example. Incidentally, the Tanzanian Railway ran ferry services on Lake Victoria, and the ferries were also consuming fuel as high as proportionately as the locomotives were. A consultant had gone on the ferry to do the same kind of footplating that I was doing on the locomotive. And when the ferry reached its destination, the consultant was declared dead, saying that he had fallen off the ferry and drowned. The Tanzanians were very sure that he had been pushed off. Anyway, we did the trial, reached the destination, and as we had expected, no refueling was required at Dodoma, and the loco went all the way from Dar es Salaam to Tabora without any difficulty. On the way, I could see at many points, especially near level crossings, there were trucks standing and there were persons standing with jerry cans and with drums and so on. Obviously, the locomotive used to stop there, and they used to steal fuel from the locomotive. Another fallout of this was, normally this train ran very late on the day when we footplated, because they did not stop anywhere to sort of allow the fuel to be pilfered. The train ran on time. So apart from saving the fuel, we also improved the punctuality. There were a few maintenance problems on the locomotive also, which were causing fuel to be consumed. But those were very, very minor. The primary problem was pilferage only. Tanzania is a very interesting country. About 26% of the Tanzanian land has been either wildlife parks or wildlife reserves. The big names like Serengeti and Ngorongoro crater are well known. But apart from that, there are a large number of smaller and equally stocked wildlife reserves and parks. Since I'm a bird watcher and a wildlifer, I took full advantage. Every weekend, I should travel to one of these wildlife reserves and have a look at them. Not only to see the animals, but also to see the birds. While we were in Tanzania, there was a 4-day weekend: Good Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Easter Monday. All 4 were holidays. And with another person who was posted there from RITES, Mr. Arvind Chandra, who happens to be a member of RES also. His wife and me decided to travel around Serengeti and Ngorongoro and that area. On the last day, that is on Monday, we found ourselves in what is the Arusha National Park. Now, as you can see, Arusha is at this point, and this is the Arusha National Park. It's got a huge crater called the Meru crater, and it's got a smaller crater here called the Globe-trotting crater. You can get an idea of the size of the park by the Globe-trotting crater, which is 3 kilometers across. The Ngorongoro crater, incidentally, is 18 kilometers across. You can drive down the sides of the crater and go to the floor of the crater and see the wildlife there. Ngorongoro, the Globe-trotting crater, they don't allow you to go to the bottom. But as you can see, one dirt road goes along the edge of the crater. You can walk up to the rim and look down the crater and floor and see the wildlife there. And there was a fair amount of the normal standard wildlife that you see all over Africa. This dirt road from the rim of the volcano, at some places it was about 10 meters away. And at the very end, it must have been about 60, 70, or maybe 80 meters away from the edge of the rim of the volcano. This area, incidentally, is forested. So from the dirt road, you could not see the rim of the volcano. So they were along the rim at this point. They had fenced the rim and they had viewing points where you could go and have a look into the floor. There were 7 viewing points in all. We stopped at the first 6 and went there, had a look, came back. When we reached the 7th point, Mr. Arvind Chandra tells me that why don't I go and have a look? And if it is worthwhile, I can call them and they can also come. Otherwise, it will probably be the same view as the other viewing points. So it was that instead of the 3 of us going together, I was walking down a small pathway towards the rim by myself. Being a bird watcher, I'm very quiet and I made no noise. I could see the rim away, and around there was a small clearing among the trees, about maybe 10, 15 meters wide. I was halfway through this clearing when I heard a sound on my left, and I looked and I saw an African buffalo charging at me. Now, African buffaloes are totally wild. They have not been domesticated or trained like buffaloes in India. A male buffalo weighs about a ton, and more people have been killed by buffaloes than by most of the other wild animals, including lions. These buffaloes have the strength to even take on lions. Now, I can claim that I was very smart. I ran away, I climbed a tree or whatever. But the buffalo was too close to me. It was only about 2 meters away. There's nothing I could do. But I think instinctively I did the right thing, which was I did nothing. The buffalo came and hit me. The ridge you see on top, this ridge over here on top of the horns, hit me on the side of my face. I lost one tooth and I got a gash below my eye. The bottom of the face must have hit me somewhere in my ribs. I must have gone flying about maybe 2, 3 meters, landed. The buffalo came again, hit me once in the stomach, hit me once on my thigh, and then I heard it going away. I was lying on my stomach. I didn't dare move for about 10 minutes. Actually, it must have been nearer 3 or 4, but I felt it was 10 minutes. Then I didn't have the guts to stand up. I crawled back all the way to the car. And when I could see the car about 15, 20 meters away, I got up and ran to the car. Mr. Arvind Chandra first thought that I had been hit by bandits, but when I said buffalo, he became serious, looked at me and he said, look, you have come running, so obviously no bones are broken, otherwise you would not have been able to run. There is fear in your eyes, so there's obviously no concussion either. So we ran, I told him where it had hit me, so we ran our hands down my ribs. We couldn't feel any fracture. Later on, it was found that I had one small hairline fracture, but that there's nothing really you can do about it. When we told the ranger that this is what happened, he says, I was very lucky because in such cases, the person is normally brought on a stretcher or on a wire. The date was the 7th of April, 1996, and I celebrated as my 2nd birthday. From all the countries that I visited, perhaps the most interesting was Jamaica. Jamaica is an island in the Caribbean, about 300 kilometers across from east to west, and about 100 kilometers from north to south. It's a very small island, but it had a fairly extensive railway. Interestingly, the railway opened in 1845, which makes it older than the Indian Railways. The Indian Railways were the 12th oldest in the world, whereas the Jamaican Railways was the 11th oldest. Obviously, for such a small island, as road transport improved, the railways began running into losses. So in 1992, the railway was closed down. The railway itself was closed down. That is, the Jamaican Railways ran no trains. But there were some aluminum countries in Jamaica which ran their trains on the Jamaican railway network. They had their own rolling stock, they had their own drivers and everything, and they ran either alumina or that is the raw ore or the finished product on the Jamaican railways. When the 1997 elections of Jamaica were coming up, the opposition parties had taken up the closing of the railways as an election issue. And the government felt that they might actually lose the elections. The Indian High Commissioner, who happened to be in Jamaica at that time, was quite smart. He told them that, look, you can get an Indian consultant, rights, who will come and do a study. And I'm sure they'll be able to show you that the railway can be revived. You can tell the opposition that, look, you have got in foreign consultants who are to see if the railway can be revived, and that might take care of the problem of you're getting re-elected. As things went, Wright did a study in 97, 98 to see if the line could be revived, and the government came back to power. Now, whether it was because of the Wright study, I don't know, but they did come back to power. See, we could show very clearly that the opening of the line was feasible simply because the track and the line existed. If it had not existed, to build a brand new line would have been impossible. We could never have revived the railway. But because the track and the line existed, it was feasible to revive the railway without putting in too much money. Later on, Wrights even did a detailed project report, which showed that yes, you could revive the line completely. One of the interesting concepts which we had put forward in this detailed project report was to have a land bridge across the continent, across the island. If you see this map here, you will find the main port is Kingston, right here. And this line goes across the island to a place called Montego Bay, which is the main resort of the island. Jamaica depends a lot on tourism. In fact, in the year when I was there, which is 1997, I was told that they had more tourists in Jamaica than the whole of India. Or because Kingston Port has got a lot of other traffic and it is very congested, the port charges are extremely high, about 3 to 4 times what the port charges were for ships docking in Montego Bay. We found that it was cheaper for a ship to come here, carry containers by a land bridge to Kingston, which was the main area where people were, where you had the consumption areas, than for a ship to come here, come to Kingston Port and unload its cargo here. Bulk of these cargoes, these containers that came with cargo came from the USA, which is very close from Montego Bay to Florida is very, very close. So by setting up this land bridge, we could actually do a lot of container movement. This land bridge and commuter movement between Kingston and Spanish Town and Maypen, these sort of justified the railway. This line we never revived. This line was closed and there was no point in reviving this because there would have been no traffic at all on this line. This line, this is where Everton was, where you had an aluminium mine. So this line was operational and this line could be made operational. Anyway, after the government came back to power, they lost interest in the railways. And even till today, Jamaican Railway has not been reopened. Although to the best of my knowledge, the aluminium companies are still operating their trains on the Jamaican railway network. While I was in Jamaica, I had asked one of the senior Jamaican railway officers there as to why is it that Jamaican government is paying more attention to roads and sort of propagating them rather than the railway. His answer was very simple and probably applies to a lot of countries. He says a politician can own a truck, but he cannot own a locomotive. The last country I'll talk to you about will be Bangladesh. As you can see, Bangladesh Railway is quite a good network. Bangladesh as a country is divided into two parts by its river systems. There's the river Ganga, which is called the Padma in Bangladesh, and there's the river Brahmaputra, which is called the Jamuna in Bangladesh. The Jamuna, Ganga, Padma divide the country's railways into two parts. On the west, you have all broad gauge, and on the east, you have all meter gauge. This line that you see in black here is dual gauge, that is meter gauge and broad gauge. That means the broad gauge goes as far as Dhaka on this side, and it goes all the way towards the north, towards Saidpur and so on. In fact, the main mechanical workshop of the Bangladesh Railway is at Parvatipur near Saidpur, so that even the meter gauge locomotives can be taken there for repairs, for heavy repairs. I was in Bangladesh from 2002 to 2004. At that time, India had exported WDM2 locomotives, broad gauge locomotives to Bangladesh, as well as YDM4 locomotives. Interestingly, almost all the locomotive exports and the coach exports that India had to other countries were against Indian line of credit. That is, India gave a line of credit to that country in very, very easy terms. And against that line of credit, they purchased Indian locomotives and so on. The YDM4 contract was against competitive bidding. It was not Indian line of credit. And it not only included supply of locomotives, but also maintenance of these locomotives for 7 years. For the maintenance of locomotives, the actual maintenance was done by the Bangladeshi staff themselves, but supervised by supervisors from India. So we had a team of 15 people who were there in Bangladesh in their main shed where these locals were homed, who sort of supervised the maintenance and also trained the Bangladeshis to do the maintenance themselves. Every 6 years, the YDM4 locomotives were given a overhaul in the workshop called the periodic overhaul. That overhaul was done in the Parvatipur workshop near Saidpur. And for this, a separate team was sent from India for this. While I was there, we had also supplied air-conditioned coaches to Bangladesh, and we were maintaining these coaches. Now, the locomotives that we supplied, the YDM4s, Bangladesh wanted dual cab locomotives. So what did we do? We modified the existing YDM4s by extending the underframe and putting a cabin at one end. Now, unfortunately, I'm very sad to say, this job was not done very well. And the extended underframe caused an overhang, which caused the locomotives to sort of camber too much, sort of going down at the sides. Now, when this happened, the superstructure began splitting at the top. So that when these locomotives became due for the periodic overhaul, all the underframes had to be recambered and the superstructures had to be replaced. They had been damaged to that extent. Now, this job, normally it is not easy for any workshop to do. So we had contacted a firm in Mohali that used to manufacture superstructures for diesel locomotive works. We engaged them. They supplied the 15 superstructures, came to Bangladesh, and not only recambered the underframe, but also fitted these superstructures on each of the 15 locomotives. There was a team of only 5 people from this company, and I must say they did a very remarkable job. Their supervisor was a guy who must have been in his 60s, and he was doing more work than any person I can think of. Anyway, these 15 locomotives were given POH and put back online. Subsequently, not any more meter gauge locomotives or more broad gauge locomotives have been supplied to Bangladesh. With this, I come to the end of my talk. I have not tried to cover any country in too much detail or all the countries that I've been to. Maybe at some future date, I can take one particular country and talk to you in detail of their railway system. Now, if there are any questions and answers or anything, I'll be most obliged to answer.
Jal sir, Apurva, the Bangladeshi WDM2s have
Let me
yeah.
get off the.
Yeah, the
Let me stop share.
Bangladeshi, yeah,
Yes,
yeah, yeah. The Bangladeshi WDM2s have got 3 marker lights. Like India, we have one, which has got 2 different colors.
ये प्रॉब्लम है, वो प्रॉब्लम है, ये गड़बड़ है, वो गड़बड़ है. तो लास्ट में मेरे को कुछ समझ नहीं आया, तो मैंने सोचा को.
So why does the Bangladeshi loco have 3 marker lights? What is the reason that they talk about?
Your voice is coming very softly. I couldn't hear you very well.
Sir, the Bangladeshi locomotives have got 3 marker lights. And I asked the Bangladeshi rail fans also that why do you have 3 marker lights, and they were not able to tell. So probably you can tell.
This was done in the locomotive that was supplied after I had been there. I'm not very sure why this was done.
Okay.
I have no idea. In fact, the first set of locomotives that was supplied were the same that we use in Indian Railways.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, good morning, sir.
Can I attempt answering Apurva's question?
Yes, sir.
You see, the Indian locomotives have one pair of marker lights.
Yes, sir.
Which can be set by manually. You can turn them to either red or white.
Yes.
And there's a code given in your traffic manuals. What it means, say a light engine, I think both the red lights have to be on, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So probably the Bangladesh locomotives or their operating manual must have some other coding. And it's more convenient to switch the lights on and off from the cab itself instead of coming down and pushing the knob for turning it.
Okay.
Maybe that.
Okay.
JL, you must tell us about the time the Vietnamese were fascinated by our birds. I believe due to Agent Orange, most of the birds had died in Vietnam. And even a crow or a sparrow. We had some Vietnamese trainees when I was in diesel locomotive works. And they were most sincere, most hardworking trainees that we had. And but one day when we were standing around, one of them suddenly dived into a bush. And we said, "What did you see? What did you?" He said, "I saw a sparrow." I said, "So what?" He said, "This is the first time I'm seeing a sparrow in my life. I've never seen a sparrow. All the sparrows were killed by the Americans."
No, what you are saying is absolutely correct. See, I'm a member of the Bombay Natural History Society. So when I went to Vietnam, I wrote a letter to them saying that I'll send you a monthly report on the birds that I see in Vietnam. After I reached Vietnam, I sent only one report. And that report was, there are no birds in Vietnam. And it is absolutely true. You don't see any sparrows, any crows, anything at all.
Sir, how many days did it take for you to recover after that bullshit?
After what? After the?
After
that buffalo hit.
Oh, I think I was down. See, at the time when the buffalo hit me, there was no pain at all. I mean, my whole body had got numb. The pain started only later in the evening. And it took me about a month to come back to normal.
But sir, why didn't you run?
It was too close. I mean, I could have claimed anything. It was only about 2-3 meters away when I saw it.
Running also was of no use because buffalo runs very fast.
No, and if I had tried to run, I would have probably got killed. So I did the right thing, doing nothing.
Oh. Yeah, I'd like to make a comment about African railways. Hello. A comment about African railways. Hello.
Yes, sir. Please speak.
Yeah. I was in Zambia from
You can make a comment.
1987 to 1990. And I discovered the state of economy of each African country depended upon when they got independence. Those which had got independence earlier, their economy was in a much worse state than those who had become independent later, because they had had less time to ruin the economy. In fact, at that time, South Africa was considered as good as Europe. And today, I believe, South African economy is also totally in the dumps. So basically, the Africans, they like to live like a European and without working like him. And they all, whether it is an individual, a family, a corporation, or a country, they all live beyond their means. So they are bound to keep coming to grief. That was my assessment.
Jail, sir,
Sir, I have a question.
Retired from service.
Yeah, please.
Carry on, Money.
No, I mean, please continue. I mean, this was about South Africa, so please continue.
So, Jail, sir, one observation which I had, there was a German documentary about the Tanzanian railways on YouTube, and they showed a WDM2, which is actually Cape gauge, and it had an additional bogie. In the sense, apart from the Coco, it also had one more additional leading wheel. So I would like to actually, if you remember these locos, they were in the Gundakal colors of blue and yellow, and WDM2 is all right and nicely smoking and everything, but Cape gauge, if I'm not mistaken. And I'll like to locate that video, but the language spoken is German. So I wonder what locomotives you saw in Tanzania. You saw YDM4s.
See, after I retired from rights, I got an assignment, nothing to do with the railways, in Mali, which is in West Africa. So I managed to visit a number of countries in West Africa, which used to be primarily French. Now, one thing I found which is very interesting, law and order is much better in the French colonies than in the old English colonies. For example, South Africa or Zimbabwe or Tanzania, it is very difficult to take a walk after dark. You are bound to get mugged and somebody will try and steal things from you. But in Mali, I could do it. The law and order, and around Mali, I went to Cote d'Ivoire, I went to Burkina Faso, I went to Niger, I went to Guinea, I went to Mauritania. The law and order is much better than the English-speaking countries. Even in West Africa, the English-speaking country, Nigeria, law and order is terrible. So I do not really know the reason for this. But generally,
the French
in the English-speaking country. Whereas in the French-speaking country, they're too bad.
The French have capital punishment. Straight away. That's how they maintain discipline, I guess. No.
Okay, sir, I just had a question. You were telling that South Africa was charging exorbitantly for maintenance of diesel locomotives from Botswana. Just curious to know around which time was it? Was it in the 60s or was it in the 70s?
No, I'm talking of 1993, 1993.
93, okay.
Yeah, see, almost all the all countries that I visited and which I talked about are at least 20, 25 years back. In fact, Vietnam was more than 30 years back. So whatever I'm telling you is of what the railway was like or what things were like at that time. For example, Vietnam today is almost a developed country. It has come up like hell. Whereas then it was terrible. See, I'll give you my assessment. If I have a rating of a city from 1 to 10, where 1 being terrible and 10 being very good. If I put Hanoi as 1, I would put Ho Chi Minh City as 10, and I would have put Delhi as 20 in 1985. Today, I think Hanoi has gone beyond Delhi. I visited Vietnam again in the around 20 years back, and it was, I mean, you couldn't believe it was the same country that improved so much. So whatever I'm talking about is, at least far as Vietnam goes, is more than 30 years back. It's 84, 85, 86, that period.
Okay. Yeah. Coming back to South Africa, I was wondering, I mean, you are telling it's 93, right? I think earlier South Africa had this practice of leasing out all their diesel. They used to buy diesel locos even when steam was far more economical for them, because steam was economical for them because they were under sanctions because of the apartheid regime. So they bought diesel locos exorbitantly, and then they used to lease it out to foreign countries so that they earn a lot of money from that. I mean, that's why I was just wondering whether it was an offshoot or a residue of that policy or something like that. Why they were
as far as, see, the other countries around South Africa, like say Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Zambia, had poor economies. They were not doing too well. But Botswana was doing very well on two items only. One was diamonds and one was cattle. There is more cattle in Botswana than there are people. And they exported a lot of beef to Europe. And of course, 80% of their foreign exchange came from diamonds. Result was that the Botswanian economy, the Botswanian currency called the pula, was doing better than the South African currency.
And okay.
So at least Botswana had no problem with foreign exchange. That way they were very good. So only South Africa was taking advantage that they knew they could not set up their own facility. Their holding was too small. The railway was too small.
No, let me clarify that many of these countries, for example, I served in Mozambique for 4 years. They had their own locomotives, they had their own locomotive sheds, and maintenance was done by them. For a very long time, there were Indian engineers through Wrights who had gone and maintained the locomotives. So they were not dependent on South Africa to that extent. And by the time that we were there, I think GM Motors was already manufacturing locomotives in South Africa.
Okay.
Right. I think we've come to the end of this session. So let me thank JL for a most wonderful talk. I mean, I found it really fascinating, both from the various incidents that he had mentioned, whether it be stealing diesel oil in Tanzania, or the innovativeness of the Vietnamese, and combined with the sort of professional issues that came up during his visits to these countries. It's been a most enjoyable talk. And I think if you can write about those in some of our issues, it would also make fascinating reading. So thank you very much for a very illuminative talk. And I'd like to thank all the participants also for joining us this week in this session.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
JL sir, thank you. Should I close the meeting?
Yeah, I think you do that.
Please share the recording link later on with me.
Recording band kar do.
Yes, sir. Thank you. We'll do that.